all right, my friends, let's do this. David Parsons here. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. Thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate you listening to my little program that has been on the internet for about 10 years now. I know there are some listeners out there that have been with me the whole time. I appreciate you. I shout you out. And I especially shout out the folks that are joining us on the Patreon page. I'm really enjoying doing the news trap and screenshots stuff. It's nice to have a place to talk about current events or the quote-unquote news away from the sort of social media algorithmic gristmill. I don't count myself as immune to all the appeals and addictive power of social media, but I like the Nostalgia Trap Patreon. I like spending time there, and I appreciate everyone who is supporting the show that way. So come check it out. There's a link in the episode description. So I hope to see more of you there soon. All right, so this week we're talking about comedy. My guest is Nick Marx. He is the author, along with Matt Sienkiewicz, of a book called That's Not Funny: How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them. Now, this is a subject I have been obsessed with my whole life, really. And I want to give a brief, if you'll indulge me, a brief biography of myself. I guess an autobiography. There's a word for that. I want to talk a little bit about how comedy has played a role in my life. When I was really, really young, one of my first memories was watching Star Search, I think on Saturday nights with my family, with my parents and my brothers. And we loved the stand-up comedy portion of Star Search with Ed McMahon. This is like 80s shit. This is when I'm a really little kid. And I don't think I understood 90% of the jokes, but I loved the idea of one person standing on a stage and doing this sort of magic trick of making people laugh. And I loved the way my family responded to it. It was like the sort of most fun part of the show for me. There's not a lot of video of me as a kid because I grew up in the 80s. You know, some rich people had camcorders around, but it wasn't really common for people to get video of kids back then. But there is one video of me. I think I'm in like 4th or 5th grade. So I may be like 8 or 9 years old. And it's in class, like it's at school. And we were supposed to get in front of the camera and introduce ourselves and say what we wanted to be when we grew up. And so there is this little tape of me where I'm like this tiny kid. And I'm like, my name is David Parsons. And when I grow up, I want to be a stand-up comedian. And I definitely think I said that because of the appeal of Star Search. And I saw how much my family responded to it. I loved joke books. I was super into being funny when I was a kid. And there's a deep psychology to that. But by the time I got to junior high, I can tell you, and I don't think this is necessarily an uncommon story for a lot of young people, comedy and jokes became a sort of way for me to diffuse the idea that I was under threat by bullies in junior high. I knew that I was like a little guy, like physically. I had a high-pitched, squeaky voice, and I was sort of a weirdo. And being funny and diffusing that tension and that potential violence with comedy was sort of the way I dealt with it. And so I told a lot of really crass and nasty jokes in junior high, a lot of Dead Baby and Helen Keller jokes, stuff like that. And it was sort of who I was. And now, I think that this is, again, not uncommon during that time, especially. I don't know if junior high kids are still telling really ugly, disgusting jokes like that. Part of me kind of hopes they are, because there was something really liberating about that. But I remember a very particular moment in my development that still stands out to me as important. Because these jokes were awful. I don't even know if I remember any of them, but they ran the gamut. I mean, they were crass and dirty and often sexual, but often like misogynist, homophobic, racist, you name it. I engaged in all of that stuff, as did many of the people around me in junior high. But at some point in high school, we had a neighbor that was another boy that was also like a nasty little shit. who was probably a little bit older than me. He was like 15 or 16 when this happened. He had somehow gotten a hold of a bunch, like a printed, they were like printed maybe from the early internet, but they were printed racist jokes that all had the N-word in them. They were like incredibly nasty, almost like Nazi level jokes, right? Which wasn't really my thing, to be honest. But either way, he came over to our house and he was reading these jokes out loud to all of us in our kitchen. And when I say all of us, my parents were there as well. And it is a distinct memory of my childhood that my dad interrupted this kid and told him, "We don't talk like that in this house. We don't want to hear this." And he essentially kicked this kid out of the house. And to me, that was a really important signal. And I'm really proud of my dad in a lot of ways for doing that. I know a lot of people would be like, that's like woke censorship or something like that. But my dad was just reacting to like how unfunny and disgusting these jokes were. And it was an important thing for me to hear that. And it was important that there were like lines being drawn about what kinds of things were acceptable to laugh at. So that affected me. And as my sort of, I guess, sophistication, I'll say, grew through college, I gravitated to other dudes, often like stoner dudes, who were into kind of weird, surreal, yes, often crass and offensive humor. But if you had asked me in like the late 90s or early 2000s, like what my politics were, and I really mean this, like I'm jumping to politics here for a reason. I would say my politics were Mr. Show. Like Mr. Show with Bob and David on HBO, that was my political and cultural identity. In other words, the style of humor, the sort of surreal, subversive, often anti-capitalist sort of take that they displayed on that show, not just them, but all the performers, that was my sensibility, and it was really, really important to me. In other words, comedy and what makes you laugh, and I know I'm not alone in this, has a sort of is a defining feature of who you are. I really believe that. And, as we move into an era in which comedy becomes sort of hijacked in some way by these like really unfunny, shitty, own the libs, anti-liberal, pro-Trump comics on podcasts like, I don't know, Joe Rogan and Kill Tony, and there are a million. We get into it in this conversation. It sort of blows my mind to see that happening, but it doesn't surprise me either. In other words, it does feel like comedy can be part of an ecology of politics. And, I'm thinking about now, like, it's sort of subtle how it works. There isn't really as much as liberals like to think that liberals have a monopoly on what's funny, right-wing and nasty jokes can be really funny. And I think that's part of what's dangerous about them. I remember, so I was a big Roger Ebert fan. I read Roger Ebert's website and all his reviews and really internalized a lot of that stuff. He wrote a review that was a 0-star review of a documentary, which was like a concert film of Andrew Dice Clay playing Madison Square Garden. And he said, I remember, I memorized so many of these little Ebert reviews. I don't know why. His voice was important to me. But he's a sort of prominent cultural liberal in a lot of ways, right? Ebert said that Andrew Dice Clay was a demagogue and was a sort of person that was using comedy to do the worst kind of cultural work. And that he saw all these men laughing at these racist, homophobic, misogynist jokes as the real sort of like almost Third Reich type crowd. And that was the kind of like inflammatory language that Ebert was using. And that was definitely influential on me to hear that. But at the same time, part of me is like, well, Andrew Dice Clay was super funny. Like, his jokes are awful. Like, they are racist and misogynist and homophobic. But I remember his nursery rhyme stuff. I remember actually laughing at a lot of that stuff. And I think I still appreciate Dice as a sort of figure in the history of comedy. Same with Sam Kinison. And I know that a lot of people would put that in the sort of like punching down category, but this is all part of, I think, an important conversation. And I don't think it falls cleanly on one side or the other. I think this is a really tricky conversation to have, and I appreciate the discussion I have with Nick Marx today. We'll get to that interview in just a second, because him and Matt wrote a whole book about this, and they watched a lot of allegedly, kind of right-wing comedy, and they have a lot to say. Nick gets into some stuff that I hadn't really considered before, but when I really think about like the people, like if Mark Maron were here in the room with me right now and he was saying, "Who are your guys?" There are a couple people that I think are doing comedy today that are really nailing it, and they're showing a path that's sort of not the really annoying didactic woke comedy that tries to teach you how to be a good person. I think that shit sucks. I'm not really a fan of that style of comedy, even though I think George Carlin kind of did it best. But Carlin is a unique figure. He went after the right a lot. He explicitly did politics in his comedy, but he's one of the few that actually pulled it off. And I think part of that is just because his jokes were so funny, and he remained a kind of like crass working class asshole in his persona. And there's something to the whole like kind of medium is the message thing going on here. But a couple of the guys that come up in this conversation with Nick Marx are Connor O'Malley and Tim Robinson. Tim Robinson does this show called I Think You Should Leave. I'm sure some of you have seen it or seen clips from it. I think both of those guys are capturing something about our era, about our culture, about the way particularly American society and internet society functions right now, that transcends any kind of right-left thing, and yet still tells us something important about the way that capitalism works. And they're not like, I wouldn't describe either of those guys as like explicitly left-wing, but God, Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, those Kill Tony guys, I don't find any of them funny. I really, really fucking loathe them. But as Nick Marx points out in this discussion, it doesn't matter that I don't think it's funny. There are a lot of people that do. And there's a gendered element to this for sure. When I was starting my podcast, this was in 2015 or 2016, it was the beginning of this comedy industrial podcast complex that is very dude driven. And I've always been sort of like a loner in a lot of ways. I don't have a group of 5 other guys to get on the microphones and giggle with. And if I did, I don't know that would be the podcast I would want to do. However, I recognize that has a lot of power. There is that kind of parasocial thing. And Rogan and Kill Tony, those guys are huge. They're incredibly popular. Millions and millions of people listen to them, and it's worth thinking about why. And I think part of it is because they're engaging something, some need to subvert what is a kind of mainstream, liberal, orthodox culture that isn't super funny on its own. I don't know how many of you like John Oliver and Jon Stewart and that kind of stuff. We get into them on this discussion too. But there's a lot going on with politics and comedy. I wonder what your thoughts on it are, and I wonder what you think of this conversation. So enjoy this. This is Nick Marx. Again, he is co-author of this book called That's Not Funny: How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them. Let's hear from Nick Marx. Nick Marx, thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, David.
Yeah, of course. So you wrote a book with a writing partner, Matt Sinkowicz. Am I saying that right?
Sinkowicz, yes.
Okay. I want to say the title right as we're getting started here. It's called That's Not Funny: How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them. And this is a subject that I think that people on the left and liberals often, I've heard lately say it in the way they say it is sort of like the left liberals need a Joe Rogan. We need our own Joe Rogan. or I wish George Carlin were back. And it's sort of reduced down to like this personality or this single performer. I wish that the left had someone like that. But your book tracks something much larger and much more complicated, it seems like. And I'm wondering, what was the idea behind writing about comedy? And how'd you get your arms around this subject? Because it seems the more I think about it, the more complex it is when you think about like what makes people laugh and how that connects to politics.
Yeah, so I think you captured it well there. So two kind of separate but related things. First was just identifying and describing accurately this world of right-wing comedy that had emerged during and in the sort of immediate aftermath of Trump won. So this is an entire kind of media ecosystem built for and by politically conservative people in the United States. And they do comedy shows. So Greg Gutfeld on Fox News does a late night talk show styled in the manner of the liberal luminaries like Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart and on and on. So we can talk about the figures that kind of populate that universe as we go on. But the second kind of big point that Matt and I wanted to make was that those of us on the left don't have a monopoly on comedy. There's been this kind of common sense idea ingrained in the broadly conceived left liberal side of the political spectrum. We use that the terms left and liberal somewhat interchangeably in the book to kind of get at the shared assumption that The Daily Show is comedy and things that have conservative viewers, conservative targets as part of their comedic universe. Well, that's something else. That's just outrage programming, or those people are politically aggrieved and they're not really being funny. They're just sort of pleasing their audience. So part of the work of the book is to issue a wake-up call to liberals to say, hey, this political project that we invested so much energy in, thinking that the rally to restore sanity that Stephen Colbert and Jon
Yes.
Stewart led back in the day, the idea that comedians were our next sort of political voices and advocates was misguided. And it's not enough. It's not engaged in the realm of material change, of policy change. This is a fun distraction, and it can feel very good to watch the Jon Stewart hypocrisy montage. But if Trump 1 and now Trump 2 are any evidence, that project is a failure and we need something else in its place.
That I think what you just said there is really important in terms of like, and this is something I think you identify in the book, that if there's a sense that there's a monopoly on comedy and that the only funny people are like the left and the liberals, that sets up that sets up a kind of counter punch by the right that makes it very easy to pose themselves as the foil to the mainstream, right? And be like, we're the actual counterculture. And it seems like that monopoly, and I'm glad you said the left and liberal interchangeably, because as much as leftists and liberals like to squabble with each other, it feels like this right that you're talking about on the podcasts, etc., that they sort of see the left and liberals as like one thing. It's sort of like this is the purple-haired barista that's a social justice warrior at at Starbucks or something like that. It feels like they're all just one thing that we can all own the libs sort of idea.
For, for sure. Yeah. I mean, we very much premise the sort of comedy worlds around a bifurcation, right? Two different comedy worlds because we have this massively fucked up and disappointing two-party system. And what we do in the book is analyze media economics, media political economy, right? So we follow the money. And for decades, the money was flowing into liberal satire TV, The Daily Show, and its dozens of spinoffs, Saturday Night Live, Stephen Colbert getting The Late Show, right? So there are lots of advertising dollars, lots of new podcasting platforms and TV shows and, just media personalities that generate a lot of revenue for the media industries who have politically left liberal viewpoints. And if the sort of decades of media economics have taught us anything, it's what you said, David. It's the kind of counterpunch that some other market force will eventually rise up and try to address a different segment of the audience. We see this all the time in the rise of cable television, in political talk radio, in Even in our feature films in a time long ago, right?
Hmm.
It was only a matter of time before the right, watching decades of Jon Stewart be successful on Comedy Central, would think, well, we can do that, right? Like conservative people like to laugh too. They had a couple of kind of initially awkward failures with the half-hour news hour at the tail end of the George W. Bush administration.
I
Uh,
remember everybody goofing on that too, and like sort of exactly what you're talking about from a very smug liberal position of being just like, look at the right try to do comedy. They're terrible at it. They'll never be the Daily Show.
to be sure, it was a terrible show, but this show came out in 2007, and the number of academic articles and magazine think pieces holding that show up as evidence in the 2020s that the right still doesn't do comedy, these things are still being churned out, right? People still look to that show and say, yeah, they tried that once. They're not funny. But what that causes is this kind of burying our heads in the sand effect by liberals to sort of zero in and double down on John Oliver, right? I love it when the British man lectures me on how smart and good I am and how dumb the bad orange man is. And it causes you to miss this whole ecosystem that's cropped up around right-wing politics that's cultural. It's meant to be expressive of a certain sort of taste-based idea about how the world is. And comedy is a huge part of that, especially that phrase you mentioned, owning the libs, right? Their
Yeah,
entire
yeah.
sort of basis for artistic expression is to make liberals mad.
What's funny is we talk a lot about the '90s on this show because I came of age in the '90s and the 2000s and sort of like thinking about the media landscape then. And I think aside from the internet and the kind of like media economy stuff, there was sort of like I don't know, I'm thinking about like Rush Limbaugh. And he was, owning the libs back then. He's sort of like a proto figure, and a lot of it was humor. Like a lot of in high school, a lot of the dads around me were really into Rush Limbaugh, and I remember they would laugh and laugh. They thought like it was like almost a comedy show, and a lot of it was making fun of Hillary Clinton. And it feels like, I mean, there's a lot of places we could go there. It feels like there is a gendered element in part here. Like a lot of it is about men, and we think about like just reading the statistics this morning about how badly the Democratic Party is doing with young men. And it seems like that's what was stolen. This sort of like the sort of sneering subculture that
Mhm.
had a kind of left component. Because I remember, I mean, if you remember Mr. Show with Bob and
Absolutely.
David, right? Like this was sort of a left-wing Saturday Night Live a little bit. You know, it was a little more anti-capitalist, a little more counterculture, a little more subversive, and it
Mhm.
feels like whoever would be watching Mr. Show in the '90s is now like, watching Kill Tony and like that sort of stuff. And it feels like that's important. Yeah.
Absolutely. The a couple of different things that you've hit on there. The cable TV industry, HBO and Comedy Central especially, I've written and thought a lot about in the past, tried to position itself as younger, hipper, edgier than the old three broadcast network system, right? So for decades, you've only got three channels. The 90s come along, and all of a sudden, you've got this new explosion of younger skewing programming. The research bears out again and again that these networks used comedy especially to appeal to young men. So all of the market research from advertisers and network executives saw this really tight affiliation between prized young Gen X and then my generation, young millennials watching this stuff and wanting to see more of exactly Mr. Show and The State. And Jon Stewart's early show is on MTV then. So the Paramount networks of MTV and Comedy Central shared a lot of overlap in programming. So this mentality that comedy and men belong together kind of carries over into the 2000s, and Comedy Central continues to grow with South Park and Key and Peele and
Mm.
Kosh's show, all these kind of very sort of
Chappelle Show. Yeah.
Chappelle show aggressively, left skewing forms of political humor, due in part to the George W. Bush regime, right? That was a sort of political force in place at the time. And so this gives rise to, and it gives the kind of common conception that comedy is liberal if it's making fun of conservative causes. It's masculine because we're used to seeing so many of these male comedians on air. And that is very much the cue that the conservative comedy world has followed too. So almost all of the subjects we talk about in the book are the same kind of young-ish, skewing men with a couple of major exceptions. But it is very masculine world. It's a very kind of own the libs type of humor. There's very little sort of playfulness, absurdity like you would have seen on a Mr. Show. And it's much more overt in terms of engaging specific political issues and just doing whatever they can to push the button that makes liberal mad.
Yeah, that's really important. I guess I hadn't really thought about that specifically, is how few of these comics are doing like sort of the alt comic or weird or surreal humor. Because I'm thinking about like Tim and Eric, and the Tim Heidecker has this show Office Hours Live where he does a lot. He's still doing a kind of left wing, subversive, weird humor, but he doesn't seem as popular as like Kill Tony. And he did a parody of Kill Tony just a couple weeks ago that kind of fell flat. Everyone jumped on. Everyone from the internet that were Kill Tony fans jumped on the Tim and Eric or the Tim Heidecker video comments, and we're sort of talking about how lame he is and what a cuck he is, et cetera, et cetera. But that's important. I feel like that surreal element is sort of gone. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about like Dave Chappelle's evolution, because he was a figure that I felt like at a certain point, yeah, when the Chappelle show was on, he was a big voice
Yeah.
on what you might call generally the left. I don't know if he would agree with that, but he's evolved like a lot, it seems.
No, there again, Dave Chappelle was a darling of the sort of liberal comedy world, right? He was the inheritor to the sort of Richard Pryor mantle of doing, jokes about race relations and racism in the United States. And I still think Chappelle's show is kind of a brilliant satire of its time.
Totally.
I think two things happened to him that are pretty predictable. One, he got super rich. He just got rich guy brain, right? And started surrounding himself with other rich guys. And he got old. And
Mm.
it's hard to stay at the cutting edge
How
of,
ironic. Yeah.
yeah, yes, yeah. I mean, he also, it's no accident, as we talk a bit about in the book with the case of Joe Rogan, that this world of libertarian podcasters has kind of built itself up around his comedy mothership in Austin, Texas. So Musk famously moves there in the pandemic. Rogan kind of gets his grounding building his own comedy club in Austin. And the case we study for these libertarian comedians in the book are a group of guys named the Legion of Skanks.
Mm.
Tony Hinchcliffe has appeared on this show many, many times. Milo Yiannopoulos. This whole universe of people kind of circulates with one another, and some of them are more avowedly political than others. Many of them are conventional club stand-ups, but more and more we're seeing these figures. Dave Smith, one of the co-hosts of Legion of Skanks, was the Libertarian Party's nominee for president back in 2024. So they're trying to sort of dabble into the world of electoral politics more and more, knowing that culture is the thing that kind of gains them a foothold in this right-wing political world.
Wow. God, that's so disturbing. Like it feels like, are you a comedy fan? Like what drew you to writing about comedy? Because I know you're a media
Yeah.
scholar. But
Yeah.
comedy is so, I find just in this conversation, I find comedy very tricky to talk about from a sort of like academic position, if that makes sense. Because it is a kind of visceral thing, and it is a kind of a trick. I love the way that Norm Macdonald talks about comedy as sort of a magic trick, that you have to get a specific set of words together to like get people to react in this almost like orgasmic, involuntary way, and make it happen all at the same time with a whole room of people. It seems like it hits on something really deep, and that's why I think it's so important to the political project.
Yeah, I mean, two things that appealed to me about it. One was as a graduate student, as somebody studying media and cultural studies, I just found that nobody had written enough about the stuff that I liked, or took it seriously enough, at least. So people had written lots about, oh, All in the Family and Amos and Andy and kind of famous old sitcoms and variety shows. But I was and am into the stuff that we've been talking about so far. Mr. Show and Saturday Night Live and South Park and The Daily Show, the sort of like 90s into the millennial era of cable comedies. And what really appeals to me about it is its enduring power to create in-groups and out-groups, right? So when you are in a joking environment, you either really strongly affiliate with the joke teller and you laugh, right? There's a visceral response to that. You feel bonded to the other people in the room who might be laughing with you, or you're wholly on the outside of that, right? You ally with the target of that humor. And that's what makes the format such an interesting thing for political debates and political contentions, right? Because we've seen this kind of hyper capitalized push to manufacture political divides where there might not be any. Comedy is the perfect cultural tool to kind of play into those hard partisan divides because it so clearly creates barriers between one group and one other group.
Oh God, that makes so much sense. I mean, did you have how much how much of this stuff did you have to consume in order to write this book? And was that difficult? And did you find any of it funny?
Yeah, it's a good question. The short answer is no. I did not find some of it is amusing. You can watch it and be like, oh, that's interesting. I get what they were going for there. But for the better part of 2, 3 years, Matt Sinkowitz, my co-author, and I just sort of divided up, the stuff that we wanted to dive deep into. So I watched Greg Gutfeld's stuff for the better part of 2 years, and
I
we
can't stand that guy.
yeah, but yeah, I mean, I know he's a favorite punching bag among left and liberal comedians, but you might not find it funny, but what that guy does is a comedy show. It's designed to get the aging sort of boomer audience to tune into Fox News every night, to stay for Jesse Waters afterwards, to kind of buy into the bigger Fox News brand. This isn't just the Fox News phenomenon, too. The comedian Tim Allen is someone we take a pretty close look at. So his show, Last Man Standing, and he's got a new one now. That's also, I think it's back on either Fox or ABC. The libertarian podcaster, so Joe Rogan is very much the ringleader of this universe. He can kind of claim plausible deniability about having any kind of political affiliation, but if you track the types of guests he has on his show, where those guests go on to perform, who they hang out with, who their advertisers are, again and again, he pushes viewers further and further right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then the sort of deepest, darkest, nastiest places that we spent a bit of time are the sort of neo-Nazi podcast spaces, right? The Nick Fuenteses of the world who, again, like it or not, he's using kind of very deeply, darkly ironic humor to make jokes about the Holocaust or any given sort of, troll-like humor that may just be designed to push the buttons of those of us on the left who don't like him.
How much do you think this relates to the internet? Because I mean, there have been a few documentaries. I'm forgetting the names of them now. I think The Social Network was one of them. One of them was about like kind of January 6th stuff that have been put out that are sort of thinking about 4chan and the sort of legacy of like online discussion boards and exactly the kind of, especially like neo-Nazi quote unquote humor, where yeah, they take the most sacred cows of liberal culture and really like throw it in your face in really crass and ugly ways. It seems like that stuff that used to be hidden in the sort of like toilet of 4chan is now like very much like in I don't know what we would call the mainstream now, but getting a lot of like millions and millions of listeners on these podcasts.
Yeah, we tried to focus as much as we could in the book on um, media personalities and shows that were relatively profitable and familiar and known. So there's a ton of writing about 4chan and about like actual hate groups using somewhat private communication channels to go about their operations. But if you take a figure like Gavin McInnes, for instance, right, the co-founder of Vice magazine, who has this weird sort of New York hipster media career in the 2000s and now has landed on the hard right as the former kind of founder of the Proud Boys, but he fancies himself a comedian, right? He does tours as a stand-up performer, as a podcaster, and his sense of humor is very much forged in the fires of the deep recesses of hate group 4chan networks and the sort of taking of sacred cows and slaughtering them in front of as many people as possible to sort of get a rise out of them. Nick Fuentes too is somebody who's I don't have the names of known and familiar right-wing politicians available to me. I'm sure he's like hung out with Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I don't know how
Right,
far up the
right.
chain he's gone. But this is somebody with real political purchase in the right wing, especially because he appeals to young men and has a talent for bringing that perhaps politically ambivalent type of person into this seemingly fun, seemingly playful place where you can say anything, right? You can
Mm.
joke about anything. Come hang out on the right wing side where you get to sort of do and say what you want. Don't go hang out with the liberal scolds who make you feel bad for making the jokes that you want to. So yeah, that kind of playfulness that you see in the sort of online discourse of 4chan has very much played a role, especially in supporting the young comedians populating the right-wing comedy world now.
God, it's so hack, and like so. That's what angers me a lot of beyond the politics. It's just like they're just bad comics, and like
Hmm.
part of it, and I know that's a subjective opinion, and a lot of people laugh at this stuff. But being a Mr. Show guy in the '90s meant you were sort of like a comedy snob, where you looked at Saturday Night Live even, and you're like, that's lame. They're not. There's no. That's not good craft. They're
Hmm.
not crafting good subversive jokes that are multi-layered, etc. I wonder would they even exist? And this is part of what I'm wondering with your book and how it lands on this is like, would this alt right comedy thing have existed? Could it exist without the sort of smug liberal as foil? In other words, like it seems like it's
No.
their only joke in some ways is playing themselves against these libs.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, how much is it like is the liberals' fault for for like having that smug attitude? Because I definitely roll my eyes at Jon Stewart and John Oliver, even though I often agree with where they're coming from. The smug sort of attitude,
Hmm.
it is off-putting, and it does feel like it's an ingredient in creating the kind of opportunity for the
Yeah.
for the right to be punks in going against it.
I think I think there is something to that in its worst moment. So I do think that the John Olivers of let's take John Oliver as an example, a British man occupying the crown jewel of the TV world still, right? HBO, regardless of how old you are, I still think that that acronym means something to you as being good, better, more prestigious because you have to pay for it than the other types of TV. His show essentially delivers these 20-minute long lectures. That's really there's really no other way to describe them other than lectures, punctuated with the good old-fashioned Daily Show hypocrisy kind of call out, right? He plays a clip of Trump saying something and then makes a joke that's premised on, get a load of this guy. Can you believe Trump and his followers actually believe this?
Yeah.
And it is it's part smugness, absolutely, but I just think it's gotten stale. I'm just so sick of having somebody on TV, on my phone, telling me, hey, you're smarter than what Trump is saying. Because I know that already. I've known that. Liberals have known that for 20 years, right? Back to George W. Bush. We were smarter than Bush, too. But it does little to explain their power and their appeal to people who don't care how smart their president is. They just care that their president takes action and punishes their enemy. So I think the lesson
Mm.
that the right-wing comedy world really picked up on is that politics is not about winning a or like getting the highest grade on a test, on a final exam. Politics is about acquiring and maintaining power by whatever means necessary. And so they recognize that constantly bullying and putting down your political opponent in the form of joking is one extremely powerful way to hold political power, making them seem dumb, weak, smug, humorless, whatever it is you want to accuse the left of doing. They figured out a really successful way to do that with comedy.
Yeah. And the humorlessness is ironic too, because it's like, yeah, as much as John Oliver's show is ostensibly a comedy show. It is a very serious show. It
Yeah.
feels like you're consuming NPR or something while you're
Mhm.
watching it, and you can sort of pat yourself on the back for knowing the things that John Oliver knows and is telling you. But it seems like that smug seriousness, that humorlessness, that's another opportunity. And part of me is just like, God, is this like medium is the message territory here
Mhm.
in part? Because it's just, aside from any kind of analysis of Kamala Harris as a candidate, she didn't have a kind of authentic humor to her. And that part of it seems important.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Whether you like their seeming authenticity or not, I think many voters correctly surmised, at least the voters that did not turn out for Harris like they had hoped, right? This weird, endless pursuit of young men that seems to be the obsession of the Democrats now. I think many of those voters correctly read that ticket as being just the kind of propped up non-Trump option that didn't hold much appeal outside of being the non-Trump option, and the Trump option being the one that you either liked it or didn't, but at least he was being sort of like whatever weird diva-y version of himself that he was.
totally.
And I think you saw that in part on the October podcast tour that Trump did on Andrew Schultz's show, on Joe Rogan's show, on Theo Von's show. And you contrast that with the sort of mainstream comedy circuit that Kamala Harris and other Democrats before her have done. And that's the big kind of bland late night shows where they stick to talking points, right? So Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Fallon and elsewhere. These are not places for intimacy, for authenticity. These are places for scripted kind of speaking points. But if you see kind of Trump's run up to the election in November, he's very kind of bizarrely, openly talking about his drug use or lack thereof with Theo Von. He's letting Andrew Schultz crack wise about his son Barron being a lascivious young man at NYU. So whether or not you buy any of that is a totally separate issue, but you cannot deny the fact that the right has sort of figured out how to break through to this suddenly prized demographic of especially young and non-white voters that the Democrats are going after now.
Yeah, you sent me that Vulture piece, and I'll post it in the episode description so people can check it out. But it seems like you guys were calling it, and I felt the same way, and I'm glad you sent that because it seems like you guys knew that, when you saw Trump on going on Theo Vaughn and going on Rogan and Harris like refusing to go on any of those platforms, I just felt there was like an intuitive sense of like, oh, it's over. Like
Yeah,
and that to me speaks to how powerful these platforms are. The sense that you and I would look at that and be like, oh God, this is the closing run. This is him
yeah,
cinching the
yep.
election here. It's intense.
And to be clear, that is one factor among many other, perhaps mistakes and advantages that the respective campaigns made. We're not saying that, necessarily decided the election,
But it
only
put
that
it
it
over
was
the top, maybe.
it
Yeah.
was, but it was very symptomatic of their broader strategies. The sort of like, so take the figure of Tim Walz, for example. Much fanfare surrounding his announcement as VP, and much of it centered on his charm as a kind of authentic, like down home, funny Midwestern dad. And I just remember being very excited about his candidacy and then hearing nothing from him in August, September, and October. And it vexed me so much that he didn't also kind of go out on the Dude Bro podcast tour and kind of show Theo Vaughn how to like
Swing a
clean his
kettlebell with
water.
those guys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, like why can't this guy be the avatar of authenticity if that's what Trump is doing? It very much pains me to hear Democrats now pouring all this money into capturing back the lost boys, the young men who swung over to Trump, when it was that very demographic that they were so loudly decrying in 2020 as the evil Bernie bros, right? We must not go anywhere
Oh
near these
God.
young men because they bring all these problems into our party. So I find myself, yes, kind of pulling out my gray hair on the one hand, watching watching the right sort of grasp and maintain power among this demographic. But on the other, I just don't know what the Democrats want to do about this demographic. Are they sort of like evil racists, or are they the future of the Democratic Party, and we must figure out how to speak to them again?
That's great. That is something that has not been resolved fundamentally. What do we do with the bros? Do we appeal to them or listen to the loud voices in the Democratic Party that say, fuck the bros, like they're a
Yep.
bunch of like racist assholes, but we need them so badly and we're
We-
fretting over losing young men.
Yes.
God, yeah. I wonder what the if we can talk a little bit about the class dynamic at work here, because you mentioned Tim Allen, and like he's another guy in the 90s who you can see the seeds of this a little bit in Home Improvement. Even though Home Improvement was sort of a folksy, corny family show, his like grunting tool guy is sort of a little bit of like the real working American, right? And the fact that he becomes more magnified as in the Trump era makes sense to me. But it feels like whether it's real or not, there's a class element to this.
Mhm.
And that sort of smug liberal is often positioned as the rich guy,
Yeah.
or even maybe, and I hate to say it, but like the academic college guy, you know?
Absolutely. Don't forget though that um, Tim the Toolman Taylor wasn't just the tool guy. He was a TV host. He had a TV show premised on the idea that he was this very handy guy. And I think that describes pretty accurately the type of sort of class-based populist appeal that the right imagines that it has, right? We're going after these middle and lower middle class, blue collar type folks, but really the sort of voting base among that demographic are the like $100,000 lifted truck HVAC repair people who will make twice as much as I will on any given year as an academic, right? I think
Yes.
they think they're making lower class appeals, but really the sort of core of their demographic are the just as wealthy or aspirationally wealthy versions of those working class folks. And it's the same type of thing. I think you can see the same type of class divide in academia. Those of us, many of my colleagues who are fortunate enough, lucky enough to have tenured positions, we support politely our Democratic colleagues, and we are Harris supporters or were. And then the folks who are a little more down the pay scale in terms of salary and precarity, right? So adjuncts and graduate students, those are the folks much braver than I to speak up about the issues that affect them, to identify class as a core sort of demarcation point between actual material political rallying and goals, and the ones that are just the sort of symbolic ones that people in my sort of class position tend to hold on to a little bit more.
Ugh, you're touching on some third rails there, but
Yeah, I'm gonna
it's so
I,
good though. I mean, I'm a lifelong adjunct, and this divide is like sort of unspeakable in some ways, and yet very much there. And it's funny because if you're outside of academia, you don't know that this divide even exists. It's another one
yeah,
of those things of like the right is going to look at all of academics and paint them with the same brush. They're all, just a bunch of like woke snobs, rich woke snobs, and not realizing that like the same sort of divides in class, in
yeah.
sort of like concentrations on identity politics, etc., are happening at the university level too. That's something that I think is really important. It makes me think like what are the differences in comedy tastes between full-time tenured professors and adjuncts.
Well, you might not be surprised that in talking about this work, the common refrain, it seemed like the more educated you were, the less likely you were to believe me when I told you, hey, the right does comedy, right? That was like a thing that meant, oh, you're just talking about something else. You're talking about those wackos over on Fox News, and I'm not going to pay attention to them. But when I would talk to my coworkers, graduate students, adjuncts about this, there was much more a level of huh, that's interesting. Oh, I know somebody who watches that. Are you talking about Oh, because my students watch Joe Rogan. There was
Yes.
much more of that quick flash of recognition of it being a real meaningful thing because they probably occupied the same sort of class position and universe as the people who watch and listen to this type of thing. Yeah, those sort of class divides are very much built into our analysis of the book. They're very much meant to pay lip service to that seeming populist appeal that the right has on its face, but underneath is very much propagating the same kind of wealth accumulating big beautiful bill supporting Republican that you're more familiar with.
It's so interesting. And I mean, I spent a lot of my teaching career at CUNY, the City University of New York, and community colleges and like teaching quote unquote working class populations. And I've watched this evolution happen in their tastes. And part of me is wondering like how much do certain professors know their students and know what their students are consuming. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean all the students have gone right wing, but it feels like they're consuming a different kind of media
Mhm.
than perhaps the full-time professor is, and even the adjunct. I mean, part of it like makes me think about graduate school and pursuing a higher education and going further into getting advanced degrees, especially in the humanities. You're sort of trained not to laugh at the wrong things, if that makes sense, right? Like
Sure,
that's part of the training of being like a professor is sort of recognizing that certain subjects are off limits to
for
laugh
sure.
at, right?
I'm fortunate enough to work in a field where my colleagues and I, for the most part, are curious about all types of art and media. And I can talk to most folks about this stuff and have it be lovely. But you're right that if academia, at least in part, is taste acculturation, at least in the humanities, right? There's canon, and you must study and understand what the good works of art are before you can spend time thinking hard about the bad works of art. I don't buy that. I mean, I have the stuff that I really like, and I'm happy to talk about that. But the stuff that's more interesting to me is ordinary culture. It's the stuff that we throw on Netflix in the background while we're folding laundry. It's the stuff that my students are watching on their phones 2 minutes before class starts and they're distracted by it. The cultural theorist Raymond Williams posited that culture is ordinary. It is the thing that is all around us and with us all the time, not the thing that you have to pay a separate admission for to go to the special building and have a special sense of a special set of critical tools to understand in an art museum. So I do kind of buy and respect the intellectual heritage of humanities-based art criticism, but I don't think that is as useful a political tool to understanding the current moment as studying the dreck of
Yeah.
Joe Rogan and Theo Von and others.
Yeah, it's like a high culture, low culture thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
God.
something students still really respond to, right? I do this all the time with my own students. Their eyes light up much more quickly when you kind of meet them where they are and just ask them what they're watching, what they're into, without judgment, without saying, yeah, that's the weird stuff that you watch on your own. Now I'm going to throw on Citizen Kane and we're going to talk about that for the next hour. I've had to do that plenty of times before, but if we're going to think about culture and especially comedy as a political tool, you have to meet people where they are. You have to think about it not as a tool of judgment or of persuasion, but of socialization, right? That this is a thing that gives me meaning. Let me tell you about that meaning, and don't cast any judgment on somebody for telling you about that.
God, that's so good. It makes me think of a term that people don't use as much anymore. But do you remember people talking about like quote unquote conscious hip hop? And like there was good,
Yeah,
it was like totally in the academic
sure.
world. There's like good hip hop, which is like the socially conscious stuff that doesn't
Yeah,
talk about like anything gangster
yeah,
or
yeah.
isn't misogynist, etc. And then there was like all the bad hip hop, and it just feels like that tracks here in terms of comedy. You can like
Yeah, that
bang
were
your head
there
against the
was
wall, but it exists and it's popular.
there was the Roots and Mos Def and Talib Kweli as opposed
Yeah.
to all the sort of like bling rappers of the 2000s. And we're still doing this with comedy today. Um, Netflix made a big deal a year or two ago out of its push to program more what it called elevated comedies. So these weren't the comedies that were, the dumb dick and fart joke type things. These were comedies like, Aziz Ansari's Master of None, and the things that could be aspirational and award winning. And always built into those terms is a very often a class-based distinction. There's an education-based distinction, right? Like these are the things that are going to have references to literary works of art and Greek mythology. So if you're smarter, you'll enjoy it more. I love those shows. I love all types of media, but that's the stuff that's most commonly talked about and thought about among academics, at least. The stuff, like I said, that matters in a material sense to me the most, in a political sense, is totally ordinary, and we carry it around in our back pockets and put it on in our earbuds all the time.
That's so funny. I mean, they did that with horror movies too. The elevated
Yeah,
horror movie,
that's
right?
right.
The Jordan Peele Get Out and stuff like that. The stuff that has a social conscience to it and a message. And there's something so fucking condescending about that,
Yeah,
honestly. And
yeah,
as a guy that likes, I don't know, really vicious, dirty horror movies, it's kind of
sure.
it even seemed to like go against the very idea of a horror movie, which is like should be to me should be near pornographic in its sort of social attitudes and violence. I don't know. It's intense because it feels like there is a kind of sort of didactic expectation for a lot of academically minded people and whatever you might call the sort of like liberal bourgeoisie that the media should be teaching you how to be
That's
good.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I that is a sort of idea about media and culture that I and many people that I communicate with in my academic circles fundamentally push back against. That
Yeah.
media are not didactic. They shouldn't have like a main message that we all come away with at the end of the program, and that's what South Park is making fun of, right? That's what Stan and Kyle. I learned something today. If
Right.
you
Totally.
recall that, it's about the process of watching. It's who you watch with. It's what you catch on your third and fourth repeat viewing of the thing. It's messy and ambivalent and contradictory and chaotic. And I think part of my job as a media scholar is to simply describe that messiness and ambivalence and chaos and understand it better so that people can make their own kind of decisions on what they like and what they don't like about it. And oh, this thing that's part of the canon, I do really get and want to latch on to it, but that part is too pretentious.
Hmm.
Yeah, that culture as a thing that enlightens, that teaches us, that makes us better. Sure, great. I leave that to somebody else to teach and do. I'll just come and hang out with you and talk about how dumb Joe Rogan is for an hour.
Well, I know we should wrap it up, but I wanted to ask you because just in this conversation, I wonder if you would agree with this because it's come up as a thought for me. Is like, is part of the reason the right is winning in the comedy game is that there is a sort of like savvier audience that maybe it's the internet, maybe it's social media, maybe it's the fact that so much culture got so meta at some point, and we've gone through decades of meta culture that people sort of see through that didactic element. They see through the like teaching element, and just like South Park has like taught you to sort of call bullshit on the idea of a lesson and roll your eyes at that, and it seems
Yeah.
like an audience is ready for something different.
Here's where I get a little bit pessimistic in the face of algorithmic technology. I don't know if it's that audiences have gotten smarter and savvier and more discerning, and it's just more that the technology has become more and more precise in being able to target and program for ever increasingly specific sets of audience categories and audience members. My favorite piece of comedy of the last several years is Connor O'Malley's stand-up solutions. So he's one of the
Yes.
people who hangs out with the Heidecker and
He's fantastic. Yeah.
yeah, he's brilliant. And I think his sort of worldview of how capitalized technology and masculinity combine precisely captures the rise of right-wing comedy. It's this unending uh, stream or constantly available mixture of just like rise and grind, entrepreneurial, pornographic, mindset. You got to be working out and betting the hottest babes and doing better than your opponent. And it's only you, the individual, that can do it, not any sort of collective of people doing it. I think that's very much the same mindset, the one that he's identifying there and making fun of. That's the same mindset that right-wing comedy has kind of identified as its key audience member. These atomized, lonely, aggressive, aspirationally wealthy young men who think, fuck everybody else. I want to get as big, rich, and powerful as I can. And part of that means identifying and making fun of weaker people who want to do things like collectivize or, be in a group of solidarity.
Mm.
So I think that technology's really helped right-wing comedians sort of identify that group of possibly alienated young men more than it is that viewers, listeners have become more discerning.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And it's super scary too, because
Yes.
you're right. Comedy does have a power to create inside groups and outside groups, and it seems like that's the power of fascism too.
Yeah.
Is this sort of like idea that you have an elite, and there's ironies to that as well, because I saw, there was a lot of clips of Anthony Jeselnik on podcasts pushing back against the sort of Joe Rogan comedy and pushing back against, all the comics who, complain about cancel culture and that sort of thing. And one of the things that he said is like this idea of like the Kill Tony group where they're all together on stage. He's like, there's something disturbing about the fact that they all agree. Like, it used to be like comedy wasn't a lone thing. You were just like one
Yeah.
person on stage with your sort of idiosyncratic take on society and culture and politics. And now it's like, in order to get on that stage with the Kill Tony guys, you kind of accept their worldview. And there's
Yeah, for
something
sure.
really to him, and I think I agree with it. It's not really subversive at all in a
Yep.
lot of ways. Yeah.
He's absolutely right about that. The sort of uniformity of ideology really is much more concrete on the right than it is on the left. Liberal coalition is, it's bigger, it's more diverse. We've got all these different pockets of people from very different demographic backgrounds, age, race, class, sexual identity that kind of have to figure things out. That's structurally part of the difference. But it means that the right is much easier to cohere around a single set of ideas and identify enemies to that idea and use joking to sort of poke at it again and again and again, right? And you look no further than the right's obsession with sexuality and pronouns, right? So much of just their bare bones jokes begin and end with "I identify as," right? They think that whole construction is ridiculous.
Oh
It doesn't
God.
get much more
Yeah.
complicated than that. That is very much the beginning and end of most of their jokes. But on the left, as Jesselnick kind of points out, there's this bigger sort of club of people working out their ideas on lots and lots of different things, and it makes for much more productive disagreement than I think it does on the right.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a lame joke, and you hear it everywhere, and it really does, to me, reflect how maddening a lot of the popularity of this sort of brand is. You've made me think a lot. Nick Marx, thank you so much. I want to mention your book before we go. It's called "That's Not Funny: How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them," out from the University of California Press. I'll have a link in the episode description so everyone listening can check it out. Thanks so much for talking about comedy with me. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
Well, all right, Nostalgia Trappers. I think that's going to do it for the podcast this week. I want to thank my guest, Nick Marx. Go check out this book, That's Not Funny: How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them. This is super thought-provoking stuff, and I think that moving forward, we're going to have to deal with this cultural landscape whether we like it or not. John Oliver videos are not going to turn the tide here, and it's worth thinking about what makes us laugh and how that has an effect on the larger political world and the way things are moving. So I appreciate Nick coming on the show, and I thank you for listening to Nostalgia Trap. go check out our Patreon page. Links are in the episode description. We appreciate your support, and we'll talk to you again very soon. See ya.